I felt, I know this is strong language, but I felt that the publicity around the book and the documentary had broken trust with the people they were asking to read and watch it because they were so far from doing what they said they would have done. I felt it was disingenuous. And that's an emotional reaction, and that may not be fair, but that is how I felt after reading it.
Hello, and welcome to this Royal History Geeks special episode looking at that perennial mystery of the fate of the two princes in the Tower, which has recently re-entered public consciousness after Philippa Langley's publication of her new and recent documentary. I am royal commentator James Taylor, and as ever, I'm joined by history writer Gareth Streeter as we look at this particular problem. Hi, Gareth.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Still reeling around all the public and internet discussion on the Princes in the Tower, which is one of the most fascinating mysteries in art
I know,
history.
and it's one of those things, isn't it, that everybody seems to have an opinion on.
Mm,
Whether
mm,
you're an out and out Ricardian, whether you think he's an absolute swine, whatever, everybody seems to have a view on the Princess in the Tower. And everybody seems to have a view on what happened to them, what should happen now, whether they can be positively identified, whatever. It's something that even people who have a very only a fleeting interest in history generally will have heard of and will have an
mm,
opinion on.
mm.
But
I think
before,
that's right.
anyway, so looking then at because this book and the documentary that accompanied it on Channel 4, which for people who are listening or viewing this in the UK is available for you to be able to stream. It came about because of the whole Missing Princess project, which is on the years 1483, 1484, 1485, etc.
Mhm.
How do you, what's your view on that and the way in which this has been approached?
I think I've got one major piece of praise, I suppose, and one major piece of criticism, which is that I think the idea of mobilizing people to go and access records is fantastic. And I think I'm aware from having, as you have done, extensive amounts of research of how little of what we could have we actually have. Yeah, we have got the bulk of of the records around the main subjects, but our understanding of those people can change quite dramatically, and our understanding of events can change quite dramatically by finding different bits and pieces of the jigsaw elsewhere. So I think that encouragement for people to go and find sources is encouraging. I think where I'm critical of the whole project is the Missing Princess project says that they are running this in the style of a police cold case inquiry. And I think the problem with that is I can't imagine that a law enforcement agency in any democratic state would allow people who have already so colorfully and clearly established themselves as partisans as one of the suspects as being involved in heading it. So I think the information gathering is fantastic. What comes next and how that information is used, I think, is perhaps much more suspect.
I completely agree. I think that asking people to go out and go to their local archives, both here and and on the continent, has been is an extremely important thing because as historians, you can only go on the sources that you have.
Mm,
And if those sources have been filed away and they're lying in an archive and you're not aware of them, you're then not able to not only inform yourself, but you're not able to take that debate any further
mm,
forward.
mm.
So I think that asking people to go out and to ask for information on those years is an extremely positive thing to do. And I think that Philippa Langley and that Richard III Society should be praised for that. But I think, as you've just said, the devil is in the detail, because it does depend on how you are planning on using that
Mm,
information
mm, mm,
and the conclusions that you draw from that information. And I think that if you are going to, I think, well, and we'll get into this in more detail, but I think if you're going to just draw conclusions based on one document or one piece of evidence, that is troublesome in itself. But particularly if you are, I think, particularly if you're looking to prove a certain
mm,
thing,
mm,
that also adds a another layer to that, and I think
mm.
that makes the whole thing a bit more problematic. But I don't want to take anything away from the positive in
It,
encouraging
it,
people to go and do that, because I think that you can pour too much cold water on it and you could discourage people from going and
mm,
making those
mm.
important discoveries.
I do think though that even, and I'm probably more on the skeptical side about the whole project than maybe I should be, and probably than you are. But I think even in the going and the gathering of information, even then, a partisan approach could affect how you do that. So, what specifically
it,
are you
it
asking the
can
records
can
office to give you? What are you noting?
well, I
what are
mean,
you ignoring?
yes, I mean, the thing I would say, to be fair to the people who are taking part in this project, is that their brief is to ask for all records for those particular years. However, of course, and I'm not wanting to disparage any individuals who are doing this, but what I'm saying is that even if you go and ask for the information on those particular years, it is easy to disregard something which you think is not related to
Mm.
the subject in which you are looking, but actually might provide context.
It,
And so that's where I think that there could be an issue, but I don't have enough detail on how people are doing that. So I'm not wanting to disparage any individuals. I'm just saying I think that could be
mm,
problematic.
mm. I think it is, and to be fair, it, it's also a weakness of any history book. So if you write a biography on um George, Duke of Clarence, Richard III and Edward the Fourth's brother, you're going to go through all the sources, primarily looking for references for George, Duke of Clarence, which is, of course, what you'd need to do if you're writing a book. But if you were then wanting to contextualize his life by comparing how his life was to his brothers at the same age, you're probably not going to spend the same amount of time searching for evidence of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, at the same point, or
Right.
looking at other dukes like the Duke of Buckingham. So there's always that
Yeah.
problem whenever you're focusing on someone. I
And
think
also,
the
you've only got so much time as well if
you've
you're,
only got so much time.
researching
Yeah.
something, and so much space as well. If you're writing, you've only, if you've got a certain number of words that you have to produce,
Mm,
could find yourself, spending an awful lot of time and effort for something which would be nothing more than a postscript, and that's not necessarily
mm,
the best use of your time either.
mm. I mean, one of the things the Richard III Society have established very well through their research, and they have been responsible for some fantastic research, is they've really commissioned and been responsible for so many studies on Richard Duke of Gloucester, future Richard III's lordship of much of the north of England
Mm.
before he became king, and established that, oh, he was a very effective lord and quite popular and did good things. But what I don't know, and I genuinely say I don't know, it could be that this has been done, and I just don't know about it. But that it's only really valuable to know that Richard is a good lord if we know how someone in a similar position was also considered, and how their lordship was also judged, to give
Mm.
us any sense as to how unique Richard's situation was. And what I don't know is whether the same amount of vigor has been put in looking at other lord northern or southern landowners, looking at other kind of mega kind of overlords of a similar period, or other periods, to see whether we can really evidence whether they were demonstrably good or worse than Richard. So there's
Mm.
always, now you could argue, and I think this would be completely valid, say, well, the Richard the Third Society don't have to be responsible for everything, and they don't. So there's no reason why other people can't, raise a popular movement or raise money and raise funds, to get things researched, translated, indexed, because a lot of the research just needs to happen in terms of taking Latin sources, translating them to English, and indexing them, because indexing is probably
Yes.
the most powerful thing you could do to
Mm.
make
Mm.
research accessible. And there's probably, and the Victorians did so much of that, and these days, people do a lot less. But that the fact that those sorts of research streams don't happen is not the fault of the Richard III Society.
No, but the thing I would say is that, you were talking about the research that has been carried out into Richard's time before he became king,
Mm,
and his lordship of the North, which I think is very valuable. But what I do think the danger is that you could draw a conclusion that, oh, because he was a good and
mm,
effective ruler of the North, therefore that made him a good and effective king. And I think that that is, again, a leap too far. And I have heard that.
mm,
I've heard that assumption made before. I'm not saying that's been made here in this particular research, but I have
mm,
heard that made before. And I think that that is a leap too far because, yes, that provides context, but of course, his reign, short as it was, is very different and in a very different set of circumstances to what
mm,
went before it. And so therefore, yes, he won't have changed his character overnight, but the circumstances in
mm,
which he's
mm.
context in which he's in as king doesn't necessarily match what had gone before when he was ruling large swathes of the north.
And I think and it certainly doesn't mean that if he had effective lordship of the North of England, even if it does suggest there'd be some aspects of kingship that he'd do effectively, none of that means he wouldn't be ruthless and make savage decisions. And
No.
indeed, his any effective lordship would have included ruthlessness, and that's not a criticism of Richard. It's what you needed to do to
Yes.
exercise power. But it
Mhm.
does lead, I think, to I think you've hit in the nail on the head of quite an important problem with this book. And I know we wanted to speak more kind of methodically about the strengths before going into the problems. But one of the things that I think this book does, or this project does, when it, it it has a noble idea of trying to pursue this like a police cold case investigation without really recognizing we're not equipped to do that style of investigation. So,
Yes.
like you've just said, making assumptions about Richard's character or abilities. Early in the book, they look at the princes and they look at the main suspects and they try and draw police style profiles of them based on what we know, and then those profiles are used to weigh evidence later down the line. But we just simply do not have robust enough information about any of those people in order to build that
No.
profile. We've
No.
not ever spoken to anyone that's ever met them, which is a
No.
crucial difference between that and
Mm.
a police investigation. So I think it's all part of the same problem, which is again just trying to make not very little say an awful lot.
Yeah, and also I think the other thing that it is important to say is that it's not entirely a new approach, because I have read books before, and I'm sure you have, because this is more your era than mine. But I have read books about the Prince and the Child before that have taken a cold case approach,
Mm.
and indeed, Channel 4 did a documentary in the 80s. I'm too young to remember it the first time round, but I have seen it since with the current Richard, Duke of Gloucester, where they
Oh, with the
did it
trial, yeah,
the trial.
yeah,
And so that was a similar type of approach. Now, obviously, the difference here is that they're asking people to go and find new evidence to
mm.
take part in this. So it's not entirely comparable, but what I'm saying is it's not entirely a new approach to
Mm.
the way in which the evidence is weighed up.
Yes.
Although, yes, I do appreciate that there is new evidence being added here.
Well, there isn't really. I mean, there's
Well,
one there's one
no, there's the
payment
encouragement
record.
to no.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did probably word that not as well as I could. The approach is to encourage people to go and find new evidence here,
Yes. Yeah.
and to assess that with the evidence that is
Mm.
already there. The extent to which that actually is credible evidence, I think, is the key thing that I don't want to say lets it down because it doesn't entirely, but I think that the conclusions which you draw from it can
Yeah.
let it down.
No, I agree. I agree. But there are other positives. Just to um fulfill our agreed mandate of talking through the positives. There are other positives with, I think, the way that the whole project's been conducted and with the way it's been presented in the book, I made the decision to read the book. And I must say, the publishers, the History Press, very kindly sent me a copy, which was much appreciated. And I made a decision to read the whole book before watching the TV documentary, just because I think TV can be a very limiting medium for these kinds of investigations, and I was worried that it would colour my judgment of the book if I watched the TV documentary first. And it also took me a while to to actually put pen to paper on it, because yeah, it takes a while to read these things, and we're all busy. But I think thinking particularly about the book, it's a very accessible book. It's very well written, and in its appendix, the appendix is like a third of the book. It compiles a huge amount of information, which is a very useful resource to anyone interested in the issue. And it also does what many of these kinds of revisionist stroke Richard III sympathetic books do, and Matthew Lewis's work does this very well as well, is it strips back the traditional alternative stories and reminds us that we can't be sure on that much of what did happen in those confusing years, which I think most historians do accept. And it reminds us that many things we might take as a given are assumptions. And I think it does. I think it does do that very well as a project.
And I think it encourages us to examine our own assumptions and our own biases towards the subject, because it's very easy to because we will all have learned about Richard III, at school or whatever, and so you can't come to it without those biases, that you have been taught. And I think that it is always important to be able then to question those. But what I do think, though, is that you need to be very careful the way in which you do that, because you could so easily just you need to be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, almost, because you could say, oh, I've just been conditioned to think in a certain way, but actually the evidence doesn't justify you changing your view completely.
Well, this is it, because we talk about, it's quite right to say we should be mindful of our biases and prejudices, and that is healthy. But I also think it's kind of a buzzword of our era. And interestingly, there are some people, particularly on social media, when you point out any of the perhaps problems with Philippa Langley's work, they'll say, well, you're prejudiced, you're biased, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation. They won't tell you why. They won't point out what they think's wrong with what you've pointed out. It's bias. It's the shutters go up. I mean, my situation is all right. Okay, I grew up in England, and obviously there perhaps is a prevailing narrative around Richard III, although I can't remember ever hearing anyone talk about it as I was growing up. Never did Richard III at school. And I've never seen the Shakespeare play or any variation of it. Because again, no. Well, I was part of a secondary school, tread the era of education, New Labour, not so much of those sorts of things, So we did do some Shakespeare. We never did Richard III, and I'm not that interested in the theatre. I've never seen any adaptation. So I actually feel, and this was many years ago when I decided to sit down and explore the question of what happened to the Prince of the Tower, I didn't in my mind feel that it was a foregone conclusion by any means that Richard III was responsible for their death. And like I say, I didn't have an impression from Shakespeare or anywhere else. And I sat down and over quite a long period of time started reading as many sources, including primary sources, as possible. And it just, for me, and my analysis of it was that it's very clear that while you can't prove it, it's overwhelmingly likely that those boys died on the orders of Richard III. I fully accept it's mostly circumstantial. I fully accept it's not proven, and as a result, I wouldn't expect people to agree with me. But in terms of in my own mind and in my own thinking, I would bet my house that that's what happens. But I don't see that that's particularly come from a place of love of the Tudors or a sense of prejudice that must be the case.
Well, in order that I'll give my story then. For full disclosure, I didn't study it at school either. Although I do remember reading about it as a child, because I remember having books about kings and queens of England and whatever, and so therefore that was something that I remember reading about. But I don't remember it being a particular area of
Mm,
specialism for me. I have seen the Shakespeare play, and I have seen it several times, but I don't think I saw it until I was in my 20s. But I do like going to the theatre quite a bit, and
mm,
so it's not surprising that, and especially after the discovery of Richard III's body, there were quite a few productions of it that were put on because it was in the public
mm,
consciousness
mm, mm,
again. So I have seen the Shakespeare play, but I honestly wouldn't say that I approach the subject, because my conclusion is pretty similar to yours. There is no overwhelming evidence. There's no one final hammer blow which says that Richard is guilty, but I do think that that's the most likely outcome, because I don't think there is another more plausible one. But I
mm,
can't
mm,
say that I've been influenced particularly by Shakespeare in coming to that
mm,
conclusion, or by Thomas More, or by Mancini. Any of those sources that we know of,
mm.
those sources that are most often cited. I can't honestly say that any of those sources have overwhelmingly made me think a certain way or go down a certain path.
No, and also, I mean, when people talk about um, people being influenced by Shakespeare or any sense of popular narrative, I mean, the amount of people that defend Richard the Third's innocence that have clearly been interested by The Daughter of Time, which I've not read, although I got it for Christmas and I do intend to read it, which by all accounts is a great novel, but very much fiction.
Yes,
Or the very sympathetic portrayal of uh, of Richard III by a handsome actor in the White Queen TV series has clearly
yes,
shaped some people's thinking. And I don't have a major problem with either of those two things, because I do think all forms of art can shape our thinking. But but then other people similarly have seen those things, thought, oh, this is quite romantic. I do feel attachment to Richard, but then put that aside, looked at the evidence, said, yeah, he chances are
mm,
he's probably guilty of this. But there's this whole idea as well that everyone in society just accepts Richard as evil. I'm not sure as even that is true. So I, like you, I read lots of history books about kings and queens growing up, but from what I remember, maybe I should go dig them out. I probably still got them. I
yes.
remember it's sort of, there might be a paragraph on the Princes of the Tower, and
Mm,
it was
mm.
presented as a mystery. Said
And
lots of people blame Richard III, but we don't know.
yes,
That's how I
and
remember it.
and also, as a child, I remember thinking that a lot of history was pretty brutal.
Mm,
I don't honestly remember thinking that Richard was any more brutal than, say, Henry VIII executing Anne Boleyn, for
mm,
example,
mm,
or or certainly, um, what happened, or certainly than his brother, than Edward IV, in executing Clarence. So
mm,
I can't honestly say that I approached it with that view that Richard was much more
mm,
the tyrant, or much more brutal
mm,
than any
mm,
other
mm,
of the kings in the medieval or the early modern period.
mm. No, absolutely, and I would still say that now. In the sense that I don't think I think Richard. I don't particularly agree with the arguments that Richard was a successful king, because I think history shows he wasn't, and the fact that a
Well, he
rank
didn't have long
outsider.
enough to be successful apart from anything else.
No, but the fact that a rank outsider like Henry VII was able to to defeat him, and that the landed class didn't flock to Richard's defense, is not a sign of successful kingship. But I don't think that he was more evil than anybody else. And if you look at what Henry VII did in terms of the murder of Edward, the Earl of Warwick, who by that stage, yes, was a man, and but may have had some learning or
Yes.
mental vulnerabilities, but he may not have. I mean, the evidence on that is certainly not staggering, but nevertheless, certainly almost certainly wasn't guilty of what he was being tried for. That
No.
that was a brutal judicial murder. Now, Henry VII's style was cleaner in the sense he chose to do it out in the open, well,
Yes.
in terms of the execution out in the open,
Yes.
rather than a kind of
It wasn't a
backroom
mystery what had
assassination.
happened to him.
Exactly. But it was just as cruel.
Mm.
It was just as cruel. So I don't think that Richard is a monster by any means. I think he was reacting very quickly to situations and boxed himself into a corner where the only thing he could do was to become king and eliminate his rivals.
Yes. Yes. So just to move this conversation on a bit
Mm.
further then, so looking at so we've looked at the methodology in terms of collecting the evidence.
Mm.
What about some of the conclusions that are drawn from the evidence which is found?
Well, I think this is where the book really let me down. And I say let me down because I was quite excited about the possibility of new evidence changing my thinking. Because although it is true that none of us, in some ways, like to abandon views that we've held and maybe have publicly held, there is a degree of I've got to double down and hold my own. But I have the biggest history thrills I have ever had is when I've been presented with either new evidence or new analysis of evidence that changes my understanding of something quite fundamentally. So probably the biggest history high I've ever had is when I read Christine Carpenter's academic book rather than a kind of popular book, but academic book on the Wars of the Roses, and it fundamentally changed my understanding of what had caused the Wars of the Roses to break out, and fundamentally changed my understanding of Henry VI. And that was such an exciting adventure. I was hoping that this might be an adventure like that around Richard III. But very quickly, when I saw how sources were used, I felt that this payment record suggests, what it says, is that actually the boy in question was a son of Edward the Fourth, um, i.e., one of the princes in the tower, although it doesn't say one of the princes in the tower. And because we know that the boy was referred to as Edward, um, traditionally believed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, that it must be Edward V, the former Edward V, the elder of the Prince of the Tower, who therefore must have survived till 1487.
Indeed. And I think that is where it becomes problematic for two reasons. Firstly, the identification, because I think that while it is interesting to give that view, I don't see it as being comprehensive proof that therefore I think the problem that is being made is that there seems to be the assumption that if it says that it's for Edward,
Mm.
the son of Edward the Fourth, therefore it must be Edward, son of
Mm.
Edward the Fourth. And I think that is problematic because I think that if even if it is believed that that's who it was rather than Edward Earl of Warwick, then the fact is that doesn't prove that it was him. It doesn't
Mm.
prove that he survived because Maximilian or Margaret or whoever was acting on their behalf here, because it's not even Maximilian or Margaret that are responsible for this receipt. It is
Mm.
another, some merchant. But even if Maximilian and Margaret believed that that really were Edward, that doesn't mean it was him. And equally, if they didn't believe it were him, if they believed it were, they knew it were a pretender,
Mm.
but they would still use that same language
Yeah.
that it were. You would hardly, even if you knew that it was not the genuine article, you are not going to say that in a document, in any kind of document, even an inconsequential document
Uh,
here. You would use that. You would
ab-
still use that same language.
Absolutely. So I certainly don't think it's good evidence to suggest that it was the real Edward V and that therefore he survived. Because in the same way that you just made the point that the administrator that wrote that record would have been influenced by the politics enough to know that he wouldn't go against official policy in terms of no, Margaret the Dowager Duchess just sponsored a real prince, etc., etc. I think that is so that they would have done what was expected of them in the same way that when you have sources written in England that describe Perkin Warbeck as an imposter, the king's great pretender, traitor, whatever, you can't take that as proof because these people were writing under a political agenda as well. So I think that it certainly can't be used, I don't think, as robust evidence that Edward V was really ever in Margaret's possession or that he survived. However, what is more interesting is that the traditional narrative has always been that Margaret was pretending it was Edward, Earl of Warwick. This may suggest that it was Edward V she was pretending to believe in rather than Edward, Earl of Warwick. But unfortunately, I don't think it's even robust evidence of that because, again, yes, while an administrator wouldn't have wanted to write anything unpolitic on the information he was recording, ultimately this document is a receipt and it has one purpose, which is to show that an item was successfully shipped from A to B and that payment had been successfully offered as a result of it. That is the point of that document. The other detail is it might help just a little bit to distinguish it from other payments, but it is not the purpose of it. And these, I've spent quite a lot of my life with these kinds of administrative documents from around this kind of period of time, and they're constantly full of errors around peripheral detail because it wasn't the point of the record and it wasn't written by
No.
someone that had much knowledge or any interest in affairs in England.
No, and so therefore, son and nephew could easily
Yeah.
be misused, misquoted, mistranslated. But I think that also the other issue that this really does bring up is around Margaret of York, Margaret Duchess of Burgundy, Dowager
Mm,
Duchess of Burgundy by this point, and that is that in the book and certainly in the documentary which accompanied it, a lot was made of the fact that she's a noble and virtuous woman,
mm,
as
mm,
though to suggest that therefore if because she's noble and because she's virtuous, therefore what she says must be she must genuinely believe it. It
yeah.
must be the truth, or even if it's not the truth, it must be that she believed that to be the truth.
Mm.
And I do think that one has to be very careful with that because that she may well have been a very noble and very virtuous person and well respected. That doesn't mean to say that she would be above being economical with the truth to suit the politics of the age.
Well, let's put it this way. So Margaret would later, say Margaret would later support the campaign of someone who was either Richard, Duke of York, the younger brother of Edward,
Mm,
or Perkin Warbeck pretending to be him. That
yes.
campaign, which Margaret was very involved with, claimed that Edward V, the elder brother, had died in the Tower.
Mm,
So, if Margaret genuinely believed that she had Edward V in her possession in 1487, some 5 or so years earlier, then she'd obviously become convinced that that wasn't the case because he'd died in the Tower, which means that
mm,
she's not a reliable witness. She may have believed it, but her judgment was faulty, which is no great
mm.
surprise because she hardly knew these boys.
No,
Or
I'd actually not only been to England once and met them,
yeah,
I
exactly,
believe.
exactly.
Yeah,
Maybe twice, but it was certainly no more than once. And she wouldn't have
yeah,
seen them since they were sort of 10 sort of age as
yeah.
well. So her judgment must have, if it was the case that she genuinely believed that and she genuinely believed what Perkin Warbeck said, then she must have decided she was wrong in 1487. So why should we trust her judgment? If, however, she did genuinely believe that it was Edward V with her in 1487, but she now just decided for the sake of a better narrative, she'd go along with the deceit that he died in the Tower, then of course then we can't say that she's above lying
No.
because she'd have to have been dishonest in that situation. But what I found so frustrating about this episode is I do think it's genuinely interesting that even though it's only one source, that it says a son of Edward IV rather than a son of the Duke of Clarence or a nephew of Edward IV. Because one thing that's always been a bit strange about the events leading up to the Battle of Stoke Field is that Henry the Seventh arrests the Marquess of Dorset, who is Edward V's elder um, half brother, who he never really trusted for very good reasons, but he
Mm,
he clearly doesn't trust him then. And he moves against his mother-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, just a couple of months, just as this is starting to kick off, and rumors of a Prince in Ireland start to crop up. And uh, and again, that's always been a bit of a puzzle as to why. So there's very good reasons to believe that people believed it was Edward, Earl of Warwick, that the boy was pretending to be at the Battle of Stoke, both because we know Henry VII made a point of displaying that he had the real Earl of Warwick, so
Yes,
why would he
that
do
was the
that?
point I was just about to make, because he
Yeah,
went very publicly, didn't he, to St Paul's,
yeah,
and then was um, offered prayers in a
yeah.
public arena with the other nobles, and then was taken back to the Tower afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So he did that, but also in other countries around the world, and the later argument from sort of Langley and others is that, well, this was all part of a Tudor government propaganda thing to make people think it was the boy was only pretending to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, because that's less of a threat. But in all the other
But it was all smoke and
countries,
mirrors.
exactly. But in all the other countries, they all thought that it was who were free from Henry VII influence. They all thought it was Edward, Earl of Warwick as well. So if Margaret of Burgundy really did believe she had Edward V in her keeping, she kept very quiet about it because no one else around the rest of Europe seems to have heard about it. But what I think it does suggest is that there could have been in the early stages, and some of these things lingered, some ambiguity as to who that prince was, which I think, if that's the case, is absolutely fascinating. I still don't think it's the most likely. I think it's just likely that a disinterested administrator just made a mistake. But if it could be a suggestion that there was some ambiguity as to which prince the pretender was pretending to be in 1487, that's a hugely interesting insight to our telling of that era. But the fact that she's gone so far as to say it is proof. She basically says it is cast iron proof that Edward V survived till
Isn't
1487.
it proof bordering on certainty, the word she
She
used?
she does use that phrase. I can't remember whether that's where she uses it or
Yeah.
not, but she basically says it's proof. I think that just, as a result, almost anyone who takes source criticism seriously is now dismissing this whole episode. That I think, although she's found something that could be interesting, she's caused it to be dismissed straight away by trying
Yeah.
to stretch it into something it's never going to be.
Well, I think that, yes, the phrase that I was taught when I was looking at source criticism was that it goes too much with the grain.
Mm,
It's too much with your narrative.
yeah,
That's why you should question it. And so, that's where I have the problem with it. Because because something suggests something doesn't mean that it
mm,
it proves it.
yeah, absolutely. And as a result, it kind of ruins the whole book for you. And you've read the book as well, because
Yeah,
she makes these bold claims in the first 5 chapters based on this level of source criticism, where she really forces the source into something it can't do, and then it builds on it for the whole rest of the book.
yeah,
Because it's then quoted as a fact for the rest of the book
yeah.
that she then just builds a house of sand on these very, very shaky foundations. That the only real value of the book, apart from the appendix, is in the first couple of chapters. Because
Do you want me
after
to be
that,
really honest
I
about
want
my
you to be
about
I
my
want you to
opinion
be
here?
really
I'll
honest,
be
really
really
honest.
honest. Yes,
Yeah.
that's where that for me is where it really let me down, and that's where I think that Philippa Langley, for me, lost credibility, because
Mm,
I think that, looking at particularly the way in which she presented herself in the documentary, she presented herself, with the whole cold case approach, and the
mm,
by going and looking at your archives. She presented herself, and I've heard her interviewed in different arenas as well, presented herself as somebody who was open to
mm,
looking at weighing up the evidence, and even if it didn't prove what she wanted it to prove, it was the evidence, and she would accept it.
mm.
But then, to me, with this lack of source
Yeah.
criticism, seems to go against what she has said she's going to do. So
That's
it's
what I mean
almost
by
as
the
though, yes,
disingenuous bit.
yes. And that's why, for me, she lost a lot, because I went into this because of the approach that she'd taken, having a lot of respect for the approach that she'd taken.
Mm,
And I lost that respect because of the conclusions that were drawn from the sources. And that's why, to me, I think that it was a great disappointment,
mm,
because just because, I mean, like you, I'm somebody who doesn't have any particular skin in the game. I don't think Richard III is an out and out villain. I don't think he's out and out brutal. I don't think he's altogether virtuous either. I think, like, like any historical figure, and certainly any one in any position of leadership at that time. He had a streak of
Mm.
ruthlessness, but that doesn't make him an out-and-out villain. But what I do think that here, the attempt to rehabilitate him and rehabilitate his image falls foul, because he may well, you could well then find other evidence that, even if it doesn't prove, suggests more strongly that he
Mm.
was not responsible for the murder of the princes. However, if you have lost your credibility
Mm.
already
Mm. Mm.
by coming up with conclusions based on flimsy evidence, then you are far less likely to be able to, if you do reach that breakthrough, you're much less likely to be able to make that case, and make that case credibly. If you
Yeah.
have already, not just your, I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about Philippa Langley's personal reputation. I'm talking about the reputation of your cause
Mm.
and your project by reaching these conclusions. If you have made that project appear less credible, or less, less worthy of attention,
Mm.
then if you did reach, if you were then to reach your end goal, how likely is that then to be perceived as being accurate, or perceived as being likely? That's where I
Mm.
think that
Well,
it has fallen
I
down.
think it's an important point, because the best argument that anyone who wants to defend Richard III's innocence will always have is that we can't prove his guilt. That is
Yes.
always the best argument. And they will therefore say, well, yes, you might think it's the most likely that Richard III did it, but you shouldn't build your arguments on assumptions or circumstantial evidence or leaps of logic. Fine. But so to then do that the other way, and to
Yes.
create theories that involve much more circumstantial evidence and many more assumptions and much greater leaps of logic, undermines the one really good point you could be making, which is that we don't know, so don't try and pretend you do.
Well, sadly, I think that that's something which is being done quite a lot at the moment. Certainly, when you look at, all of the, the because one thing, as you know, I do dislike, is this whole binary thing, that if you like a certain person, you must hate their opponent, and so therefore you get that here. If you like Richard, you must hate Henry VII. If you like Henry
Mm.
VII, you must hate Richard, and we see that very much in the narrative around the Prince and Princess Wales and Duke Justice of Sussex now. And so I've seen so many arguments
Mm.
about, oh, there are these things which are being said about either of them, because it's being made by both camps, that this is being said about them, and this is an out and out lie. But then going and making the same assumption about your favorite, but without any real lack of evidence either. So what you can't do is, you can't say, well, this is just an assumption made from an unnamed source, so therefore it's not credible, when it's somebody that you don't like. But then you can't say,
Mm.
when you
Mm.
see something that you find favorable from
Yeah.
an unnamed source, and then say, yes, but this is true because they're nice people and we like them. And it's the
Mm.
same
Mm. Mm.
approach here. You can't simply fit the
Mm.
evidence to suit your narrative. And I'm sorry to say, I think that's what's being done, even though the approach is set out that it's the complete opposite, that it's an open approach, that you're going to accept the evidence
Mm.
as much as what
Mm.
it is. But then actually you are taking the evidence and saying, well, this we can think is credible because it proves our narrative, but something that isn't credible, we're going to dismiss. And I think that is
Mm.
sadly what is the
Mm.
overwhelming feeling here.
I think that's right. And in a sense, the book has, I would definitely say to someone, if they're interested in the era, they should buy the book, because just the appendix is so useful as much as anything else. And there's probably, if there have only been a casual um involver with, well, if they've only casually involved themselves with the question of the Prince of the Town, they probably will find some new arguments they've not come across before. But if someone's sort of dug around for quite a while, or been, read around the issue with a bit more vigor, there isn't really any new arguments in the book,
No,
because even the
no,
arguments about Edward V's survival into 87 have been made by Matthew Lewis before. So
yeah.
that, although this new source arguably they would say backs up that argument.
Mm.
So there isn't really any new takes. And there's a lot of old takes in the book that I think most even Ricardians would accept as slightly debunked, like references to a Lord Bastard in the
Yes,
after
yes,
1485 referring to
yes.
Edward V when they just don't. I mean, that's very
Well,
old.
no, and the thing I would say about, the whole thing about the Lord Bastard is the way in which that in that era, styles and forms of address were not standardized like they
No,
are now.
no, exactly.
And so therefore, because Philippa Langley does make that point that that Edward V was sorry, that Richard III's illegitimate son um was never a lord, so therefore it cannot refer
Yeah.
to him. Well, that's where I do think that that falls down, because in this era you might refer to, so take for example um the prince's sister
Mm,
Cecily. You hear sources where she's referred to as Princess Cecily, or you hear sources where she's referred to as
yes.
the Lady Cecily, and that and that isn't necessarily down to the issue of legitimacy or illegitimacy.
No,
It
no, not
is
at all.
down to the fact that these things were not necessarily standardized.
Mm,
That the king might be referred to His Majesty or His Highness or His Grace. It was
mm,
not
mm,
until a later period where it became standardized that it would be His Majesty. And
mm.
so, therefore, I think that to draw that conclusion that if somebody is referred to as the Lord Bastard, and that's even a leap actually to say that Edward V would be referred to, because he was
Yes.
not, because while yes, because to say that he'd not been given because he was a prince before, and so he's not actually given us another title after he's been deposed. So therefore, I think that's a leap in itself.
Mm.
But certainly to say that that proves that it is him because it gives because it uses the word Lord, I don't think proves
Oh,
is a hammer blow
it's
anyway.
a ridiculous argument because the argument is that Edward V would still have been a peer because he'd been Earl of March and Earl of Pembroke. Well, possibly he was referred to as both those things once or twice, and I dug through all the
Yeah.
records. But although there's no record of formal creation, but then there often isn't, and they're saying,
No,
well, he's technically not had those titles taken away, therefore he's still got them. Well, there's no record he's had them taken away, but it's unlikely people would have considered him to have had, one of the heritage titles of the
yeah.
House of York as a bastard. But we have records of Edward the Fourth's one of Edward the Fourth's bastard son who had no title being referred to as my lord the bastard as well. So as you were saying, lord was a very generic term that could mean anyone of high birth.
Well,
It
and also,
didn't give a
if you
specific
look,
rank.
and even much later, somebody referred to as being the Lord of the Manor. Well, it didn't mean that he had a
No,
peerage.
no, no, no.
It could be a plain esquire, but still Lord of the Manor because he held certain lands.
It was only in that century, the century we're talking about, the 1400s, that lord um, that there became a firmer line between the lower edges of the peerage and the upper reaches of the gentry anyway. There's no the rank of baron as now is enshrined in our peerage only really became a formalized thing beyond just the bigger landowners among the gentry very recently. These were very fluid. These were very fluid, these titles. Similarly, Margaret Beaufort is sometimes referred to as my lady. She's sort of referred to as a princess because again,
Yeah.
they're both conveying her seniority. They're not trying to say she's got a specific title.
No, and way after she becomes Countess of Richmond, she's still often referred to as Lady Margaret Beaufort. It just proves the fluidity in
Yeah,
which people were referred to in that age.
yes, indeed. And as a child, she's referred to as Lady Somerset once, just probably because no one knows what her name is, but they know
Yeah.
her dad was the Duke of Somerset. So there, and that's in Parliament, and that's the problem I think that some Richard III enthusiasts have. And I think it's a problem with this project because they only look at records to do with Richard III. They don't get the sort of oxygen of this style of record keeping that helps them suss things out. So I think it's a classic example with this source that talks about, oh, it was a son of Edward IV. When you're familiar with medieval record keeping, you recognize there's just lots and lots of errors about things that don't matter because this cleric that's writing something down doesn't care about the information and
And why
doesn't
would
think
it
anyone's ever
matter?
going to read it again.
No. And why would it matter? really,
It
because
doesn't.
it's
Yeah,
not, it's something which is of a very little consequence.
it
And even now, it's a very little consequence,
it
really.
has to be enough detail so that someone checking knows which shipment of ammunition they're referring to. That's
Yes.
all that needs to happen. And I think that it's just very bad history to place so much pressure on a source that you try and get it to do something it wasn't intended to do. And
Yeah.
that's a you see it you see it. I mean, you see it done in religious circles all the time, where people try and extract teaching out of a passage of the Bible, whereas that passage was written for a very specific purpose, and it's quite unfair on
Yes.
that passage to treat it as
Like
something else.
Henry VIII.
Well, like very, very much like Henry VIII, but again, you constantly see. I mean, I know I don't mention much, but I've written a book on Prince Arthur, which is available. I
What
know.
happens have you?
Yes, I have. Very, very
You
good
kept that
book.
so quiet.
I
Nobody,
know. I
I bet
know.
nobody knew this.
Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's lost brother. But interestingly, he is
You remembered
he
what
is
it was called this time?
Oh, I did remember. He is he was made Prince of Wales at the age of 3, right? And before then, but he's often and thereafter he's generally known as My Lord the Prince in records.
Yes.
Um, but sometimes he's known as My Lord the Prince before that. And even sometimes he's known as the Prince of Wales before that, even though he wasn't Prince of Wales. It doesn't mean, and if we took the same approach that they've taken in this book, I'd have said things in my book like, although there was a ceremony when he was 3, there must be a missing source somewhere that says he was actually made Prince of Wales much earlier, because how else would he be referred to as Prince of Wales earlier? So no, it wouldn't. It's just people knew that the son of the king was called Prince of Wales. So when someone was writing a record about something else, they just wrote it. It doesn't, you can't expect them. They weren't writing because they were obsessed about titles and accuracy. They were writing to record a payment of 6 gold coins for XYZ.
And before I make another very salient point, just an opportunity for you to give the name of the book again.
Oh, Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's lost brother. Available
Available.
wherever you buy your books.
Yes. And also on a related note, when you look at the future Mary I, a lot of sources refer to her as Princess of Wales, and yet she was never created Princess of
No,
Wales
exactly.
because
So,
she was the king's daughter before the Great Matter was considered legitimate, was
mm,
his heir, and did go to Ludlow for a time. And so therefore she's referred to in the way that Arthur had been, who was obviously her uncle,
mm,
and in Edward the future Edward V had been, who were both created Prince of Wales,
yes.
but there's no record that she was ever created Princess of
Mm.
Wales. But yet she's very often referred to that in sources of that period. So I do think that that makes it very problematic. Just the fact that you have so many variances in the way in which people are referred to
Mm.
does make that problematic to be able to
But
then draw that conclusion.
someone writes to Margaret Beaufort as Duchess of Somerset in one
Mm,
letter, which she was never Duchess of Somerset, but she was in a sense, she was the spiritual and lineal heirs of the Dukes of Somerset and
yes.
the Beaufort family. So it's someone who's doing it to recognise her familial link and to flatter her. It's not. It's just these things are fluid.
And certainly when you get this is sort of digressing slightly, but certainly when you get people who claim titles in pretense, you get that quite frequently. When you get the Boleyn family claiming the Earldom of
Yeah.
Ormond, certainly, and certainly at that point when you had the King of England way after it ever became a distinct possibility as
Mm,
still calling himself King of France and using the fleur de lis on the royal arms, that was never going to be a credible
mm.
outcome, but yet it's still made for hundreds of years after that. And so therefore I think that to draw a conclusion
Mm.
based on somebody using a title doesn't mean that there were one ever created it, two that it's accurate, any of those
It,
things.
well, take a much more recent example, but take Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. She was formally barred from using the title HRH. That doesn't mean she was never styled HRH, because within their own household, their
Yes.
servants were instructed to address. So she was styled as HRH in
and
her household. It
and they were
wasn't
yes
recognized by the
and
courts.
no, and of course people who were sympathetic to them, like the Mosleys for example, they did and would
Yeah.
bound curtsy and all of that to her, but yet you wouldn't, yet that wouldn't happen if you were, if you followed the edict that had been given.
Mm, it's quite. I mean, similarly, people say, Diana, Princess of Wales, was never styled Princess Diana. She frequently was styled Princess Diana in the media, in popular conversation. They might say, yes, but that's not technical. That's not what the court did. No, it wasn't. But this is the point we're trying to make, is that the same way that there's
No,
a
but that's a
fluidity of
bugbear of
styles.
mine.
Well, it's a bugbear of many people's, but the point is, there's a difference between what someone's written down on a piece of paper and locked in a cupboard somewhere as the official style,
Yes.
and how people use it in daily
No,
usage.
I would
And that
concede
did
that.
exist in
No, I would
medieval
concede
times.
that. I would concede that. The point I would make is that because people use that style doesn't make it right.
No, but then right is subjective, isn't it? Like people say, I've heard people say Diana was never legally Princess of Wales. Well, as far as I know, there's no law that sets that out. Do you know what I mean? What does legal mean? I agree that it's not the correct style and the court wouldn't recognize it, but I think it's so important to understand how things are used in practice is different to
Yes.
what the theory might be.
Yes.
And that was true in medieval times as well.
Yes. And if you take the Duke of Edinburgh's daughter, is she referred to as Lady Louise Windsor or Lady Louise Mountbatten Windsor? And I have seen official sources use both. And I've
Yes.
even occasionally
Well,
when
that was clarified at her birth, to be fair. That it
well,
was
it was, but she's known as Lady Louise Windsor. But yes, at the time of the Prince and Princess of Wales wedding, and she was a bridesmaid, she was referred to as Lady Louise Mountbatten Windsor in the order of service. And I'd still heard, even though this was never an official thing, when her father was still as Earl of Wessex, had been known as Louise Wessex. And so therefore,
yeah, yeah.
there are lots of ways in which people might refer to somebody, whether they are accurate or whether they're not.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see that quite often with children of peers. Even more recently, when you go through the census, might just get their father's last name as a title. Sorry, their father's title as a last name, and it can be confusing if you think you're looking for one person, but they're referred to. I think there are sources that I came across where the Duke of Buckingham's younger brother is referred to not not by Stafford, but as Buckingham as a last name, and it's just because the person writing it doesn't know how it works or doesn't know the name, or and you're like, who's that? And you have to realize, oh, that's the chap I'm looking for, and all the rest of it.
Indeed. So, moving the conversation on. So then we've looked at the sources and the source criticism. But one thing that I do think is important to bear in mind is the argument that is made in the book, is that while we've been very critical about the sources that have been found,
Mm.
about the lack of sources, and certainly on the lack of sources under Henry VII.
Um, it do when you say lack of sources, do you mean that there's not much said about the Prince of the Tower?
Yeah, well, the argument that is made is that so many records were destroyed under Henry VII, under his reign, that therefore that there may be credible evidence there which has been destroyed. And
There's
so
yeah, there's just no evidence of that. I mean, the one reason people talk about records being destroyed under Henry VII is we know that one act of Parliament, the one that set out Richard III's title and made the princes and their sister Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's wife, illegitimate, we know that the government ordered all the copies of that to be destroyed. But the reason we know about that is because we've got records of the order for that to be destroyed surviving. That there is no other evidence to suggest that anything else was ordered to be destroyed. And I think what Philippa Langley's book does really well is it shows that certainly in the first half of Henry Tudor's reign, if not the whole of his reign, there was no consistent narrative around people, even around people that were close to the king, as to what happened to the princes. Some
mm,
some said they most thought that they'd perished, but there was no consensus as to how. Some people said they'd escaped. Some people said they'd be locked under a floorboard. There was no consistent narrative. And that strongly argues against this notion that Henry Tudor put out a concerted propaganda narrative around what happened to the
Mm.
princes and said, Richard's terrible, this is what he did. Because if that was the case, why did people who wanted to be in favor with the king not keep to that narrative? Why did they all have their own theories and their own
Mm.
versions of events flying around? I just don't think anyone knew.
No. And the one thing I would say that I was surprised at here is that the assumption being made is that both the princes survived and that Edward V was killed at the Battle of Stoke, and that rather than Perkin Warbeck being a pretender,
Mm,
it was in fact Richard, Duke of York. In reality, and they talk about certainly the marks that on his face and his thigh. But I have seen other books in the past make the assumption that Henry VII was guilty of their murders during his reign because it
mm,
suited him um,
yeah.
to have them destroyed because of their superior claim to the throne than his, which which is true in the
Mm,
sense that his not that he killed them, but that his claim to the throne was a pretty flimsy one by blood
mm,
right, and that his right to the throne was by conquest, and was then strengthened by marrying Elizabeth of York. But I do find that intriguing that here that's not the conclusion that is made.
mm. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the boys had a stronger claim than Henry VII. So if people want to say that gives them motive, that's reasonable. But of course, they also had a stronger claim than Richard III. So
Yes.
that would give Richard motive too. And
Mm.
what this book argues, again, which I'm surprised about because it's quite an old-fashioned narrative, is that Albert, because Richard had made the boys illegitimate, they were no threat. But because Henry had made them legitimate again, they were a threat. And that's something that in my review, I described what phrase did I use a persistent naivety to the realpolitik of medieval society, in that
Yes.
people the book seems to think that just because Parliament passed something, everyone believed it and everyone adhered to it. But of course, that's ridiculous because if you look at the history of the 15th century, there are several times when someone had been declared by Parliament to have no right to the throne, gets an army together, wins the throne, and then Parliament rectifies that and says, "Oh, it turns out they are the actual king." So the idea that an act of Parliament would have really changed people's motivation is not consistent with even the most superficial reading of the 15th century.
No, and certainly I mean the thing that I would question is how much people who were unconnected with the court would have known about those
Mm,
intricate details anyway.
quite.
And how many, well, I'm not saying people wouldn't have cared about it. I think that's too much of a sweep, but I do think that to assume that because the Princess in the Tower is such a sort of burning topic among historians today, that therefore, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that the early death of Edward IV and the deposition of his son, and then the quick succession of Richard III would have gone unnoticed by the populace. I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. What I'm saying is, though, how many people would have known, these kinds of details which we are trying to debate now. And I
Right.
think that it that makes that much less. I think that makes it less likely that you can then draw those conclusions based on
Mm.
that.
Well, quite. And if you take the argument that, well, Parliament wouldn't possibly have passed something saying the boys were illegitimate in 1483, therefore it must have been true. They would have done that, they didn't believe it, therefore it must be true. You have to answer the question of why 2 years later did they pass an act saying the opposite? Had they changed their mind or had the political situation changed?
Or they had their minds changed for them. Was
Exactly.
there, yes, either by force or threat of force, or because there was superior evidence. Um, it doesn't the one doesn't negate the other. The one doesn't prove the other.
It doesn't. But these
It
things,
means that you're acting on the realpolitik of the
yeah,
time of day. It doesn't mean that either of those is necessarily superior evidence.
yes. But even if you take, all right, take a a very different example, like so back in 2017 when Theresa May was Prime Minister, the government policy was to liberalise the Gender Recognition Act to make it a demedicalised process. That was the and Conservative MPs then who were loyal to the government were supportive of it, and where necessary, I don't think they ever got to would have walked through the not all, of course, would have walked through the lobby to vote for it. Now, today, the government policy, the Conservative policy, is not to liberalise gender gender recognition laws, and if anything, to make them stronger or tighter. And the vast majority of Conservative MPs will march to the lobby to do that. Again, of course, there'll be some that won't. That isn't primarily, then there might be that there's new evidence, but it won't be primarily because of new evidence, nor will it be because of an explicit threat probably that's been made. It's just to do with the general follow the leader mentality that has to exist in any political system for it to function.
Yes.
That parliaments acted as they did in both 1483 and 1485 and 2023.
And also, the fact is that for a lot of people in that position, their lives were going to change very little, whether Richard was king, whether there was a boy
Yeah.
king with a regent, whether Henry VII claimed the throne by conquest.
Mm,
The issues of the day changed very little, in as much as they were still looking at, whether there was going to be a successful harvest, whether there was going to be a plague.
mm.
All of those things didn't change because of who the king was.
That's
In
right.
the same way that when the late Queen died and the current king came to the throne, that didn't change to any degree the issues that are facing the country in the
Mm.
last couple of years. And so I think you've got to bear that in mind as well, that a lot of these decisions were being made on practical um on the practicalities of the day rather than
Mm.
necessarily because of any ideology.
Well, I also think that it's become quite fashionable to assume that the nobility were all entirely self-serving and had no sense of civic or national duty. But actually, I think there's quite a lot to suggest that that's not the case, and they did consider themselves stewards of their own localities, where they ruled almost as sort of mini kings, but
Mm.
also of the nation as a whole, as the old blood of the realm, as they saw themselves. I do think they considered it their duty to provide political stability, which meant having a king on the throne who was able to rule effectively, because all those things that you were just talking about in terms of, all right, they could control the harvest in terms of the weather, but they could control creating the right framework for the agricultural economy to work properly, keeping order on the streets, protecting our borders from foreign invaders, making sure that we were trading successfully with other nations and bringing that prosperity. You did need a strong king that was able to do, or at least a functioning king that was able to do those things. So when in 1483 they may have decided, well, look, to be honest, the princes are probably already dead. Richard's there now. He'll probably do an all right job. Yes, we'll get behind that. To then suddenly think in 2 years later, say, okay, well, Henry's won now. Um, we can make a good go of this. He's got Elizabeth of York. That will help. Let's make this work. It's not just that they were political turncoats that would do anything to survive, although there was probably an element of that. They genuinely probably had, at least in some ways, the best interests of the country at heart and wanted to deliver that stability.
Indeed. And as always said, those issues do not go away, and so
Mm,
therefore it makes very little difference really. And it's a case of looking at who is going to be able to support the economy, who is going to be able to deliver
mm.
for the people, and therefore it's a question of looking at the realpolitik of the day. So just moving on then. So where does this book and this evidence leave us where the debate is on the princes?
I mean, and this is where I do conclude that I will be subject to a degree of confirmation bias. But I think we're no further on, really, in terms of the debate around the fate of the princes. Um, and if anything, it confirms to me that we can keep looking, looking, and looking, but we're probably just not going to find anything that gives us any more meaningful evidence than we've got now.
No, no.
And that we may not have enough to go on, but we've probably got all we're going to get. What I think is possible, though, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this, because you've read my review as well. You kindly read it before I put it out there. Um, is I do think
Well, very
there
well written review. I
that's
did say that to begin with. I must
that's
point out.
very kind. There are things that could come out of this activity, but I think they will only be able to come out and be seen for what they are if the Missing Princes project abandons its unspoken quest to prove the innocence of Richard III. So
Mm,
let me give you a few examples. I think it would remind us that there were mixed views about the fate of the princes, both in Richard's time and in Henry VII's time. I think it could show us that there probably wasn't a concerted Tudor propaganda campaign in the early years, at least, of Tudor government. Um, I think it would remind us that we don't know quite a lot about the Battle of Stoke in
yes,
1487, and that a
yes,
lot of what we know comes to us from government sources, which cannot be necessarily trusted. And it could even mean that there may be some ambiguity around who the Irish and Burgundians believed they were fighting for at Stoke and who Henry thought his enemy was at
yes,
Stoke. And those things might seem modest, but they would really change the way history books about the 1480s are written. And I
yes.
would love it if those things could be explored more. Regret, and this is probably the most controversial thing I've said about the whole project, but as
Go on. We've got
brilliant
some controversy.
as brilliant as Philippa Langley is, and I think she has been heroic in terms of the energy and enthusiasm um, and zeal she's brought to things. I think the Missing Princess project would now be better served if someone else took the leadership, someone who was less wedded to one side or the other in the
Mm,
debate
mm.
and carried on the activity, but was able to present it in a slightly more objective way. What do you
Mm.
think?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. For the reasons that I said earlier, I think that for me, it's very difficult because I actually think she's a very nice, a very personable character,
I've
and she
heard that.
writes
I've
very
heard
well.
that. Yeah.
I mean, I've not met her person, but from the impression that I've had of her is that she seems very personable. It certainly comes across very well on camera and when I've heard her interviewed. And I think that she writes very well as well. Her
Mm,
style of writing is very accessible. But I think that for me, it goes down to that, to drawing those conclusions where I don't think the evidence really stacks
mm,
up. But the fact that she had made such a public declaration that she wasn't going to do that,
mm,
that's why I
mm,
think that she's lacked that credibility. And so therefore I think that, but what I would also say is that no, I don't think it's likely we'd find any more evidence, but Langley would say, and there is merit in this. People said that before Richard III's body was discovered.
mm.
People were convinced that his remains had been thrown into the River
True.
Soar,
Mm, mm,
and it was only through her tenacity, not just her as an individual, but through
mm,
spearheading that project, that you were able then to find his body. But what I do think, though, is that there is a false equivalency between the two, because when you found Richard's body, you could prove it was his body by the DNA testing. Yes, it was a very convoluted and difficult
mm,
process to be able to find somebody with the correct DNA, but essentially you could prove whether it was Richard or it wasn't. And
mm,
when you found it was, then you were then able to bury him. You were able then to correct the narrative in history about what had happened to him. Admittedly, that
mm,
was more of a footnote in history because the story of Richard is more about what he did, more as king rather than what went before it. But
yeah.
certainly, the way in which he fell at Bosworth, what had happened to the princess,
Mm,
that's and what had happened to him after Bosworth is really a footnote. But
yeah.
it did correct something which was out there, which was common in the narrative. There wasn't really the evidence. It was based on a source that turned out not to be credible. Here, though, it's very different because even if you were to prove that the princes because people often talk, and certainly there is talk in the book about whether you could carry out more sophisticated DNA testing on the remains of the princes,
Mm,
or who are believed to be the princes that are in Westminster Abbey, because it's nearly 100 years since those remains were last looked at, and certainly there's been no enthusiasm from either from Westminster Abbey or from the monarchy for that to happen. I think that where the false equivalency comes in is that even if you found that they were the remains of the princes,
mm.
it would not prove when they died
No,
or by whose hand.
no.
And if you found out that they were not the remains of the princes,
Mm,
it would not prove that they survived either.
I agree. Yeah.
It would just prove that the source material from Thomas More, which meant that which was used, to say that they'd been buried under a staircase, that was incorrect. It would not prove that they didn't die by Richard's hand.
Mm,
It wouldn't prove that they weren't killed in the tower. It would simply prove that they were not their remains. And so that's where I think that's where it's very different, because you are not looking at something which you can
mm,
prove
mm.
through testing, through hard evidence.
Yeah.
But because you're not, we're not looking, identifying them as the princes or not is only a part of the story.
Mm,
It does not give you the rest of the narrative about what happened to them, if they were killed, by whose hand they were killed. It doesn't prove any of those things, and I think that I fail to see a way in which you will find that evidence
but
now.
I don't think you will. I mean, I suppose if it did, and presumably they do this by establishing a genetic link between those remains and between Richard III. Um, but if they did that, it would, I suppose, eliminate all the survival theories and
It
Perkin
would.
Warbeck.
It would.
But that's all it would do.
Well, yeah, it would. I'm not saying there'd be no merit in it, but it wouldn't prove whether Richard killed them or not.
Do you know what? I don't even think it would, because I think people are so wedded on this issue that even if you prove that those, and I don't know much about DNA, so I don't know exactly what would work. I think if it turned out that it proved that those remains were two nephews of the Greyfriar remains and therefore nephews of Richard III, I'm sure people just are saying, well, maybe it's two illegitimate children of Edward III or George of Clarence that no one knew about, and it's not the
Yes.
princes. I mean, I don't know, unless you could somehow check the Woodville line, which I don't possibly see how you could do, but maybe you could
No.
as well.
No, or even, as some descendants of one of Richard's sisters.
Yeah, yeah, or
You know,
some,
or some other relative, a
yeah.
cousin or something. It wouldn't necessarily prove that it were.
Mm,
It wouldn't necessarily prove that it were them. It would just prove that it was somebody in the family line. Although I do suppose, with the circumstantial evidence, although one has to be very careful with circumstantial
yeah,
evidence, you've already said, but the circumstantial evidence that it was found in the place
yeah.
that it was claimed to be, and is proven to be of the right genetic link, would
Mm,
make that more credible. But but in order to apply that same degree of fairness which we have said that we need to do,
mm.
it wouldn't give you that out and out proof, that it wouldn't give you the certainty, would
No,
it? It would give
no.
you a higher degree of probability, wouldn't give you the certainty.
Mm, mm. No,
And again,
I don't
I
see
think
it will.
that's then again, I think that a higher degree of probability is all that we could ever ask for in this.
I think that's right, and I think it will. I think some people will consider it an end to this debate, but
Mm.
not the fanatics on either side. Um, and I've already heard people on social media, and again, I don't know much about DNA, and I don't know whether they do or not, but saying things like, "Oh, the bones are so corrupted that no DNA result could be reliable." So I
Mm.
feel that people are already starting to
I,
sow
I
the
I've read
seeds
that
for.
too. I've read
Yeah,
that too. Yeah, yeah,
but I think people are just starting to sow the seeds for saying we don't accept these results,
yes, yes.
because I think it
Uh,
will happen. I think the DNA testing will happen one day.
Wonder. Well, I don't. I mean, I'm less sure on that, but I think I, my worry is that even if it does happen, what conclusion do you draw from it? what what will it prove? I
Yeah.
fail to see I'm not saying there's no merit in it, but what I'm saying is that it won't prove Richard innocent or guilty.
To be honest,
It would.
from a kind of historical point of view, I'd probably kind of just like to test every bone in the abbey for some, but I recognise that, and I get very frustrated when people are like, why won't the church allow that? This is terrible. It's like, well, the Church of England. Now, I'm not an Anglican, as you know, but the Church of England is
I
not a
am,
national.
as you know.
I know is not a national heritage organisation.
No.
Its primary duty is to respect in this regard is to respect the sanctity of the dead. Now, I don't personally have strong views around disturbing the dead, or because I don't have a very sort of ceremonious or sacramental religion, but I absolutely respect other people that do. And the
Mm,
boys are and the bones are in their charge. So when
yeah.
people are getting patient with them, I'm like, no, no, no. This is they don't exist to satisfy our curiosity.
No, and I think the way that I would approach that, and it's not a particularly sacramental view, but is that if they were my relatives, I might find that not unholy, but I might find that a bit disrespectful. And so therefore I could see why you wouldn't want to do that
Yeah.
unless there were going to be a real benefit from it. And I fail to be convinced on what that benefit would be,
Well, this is
because
the
it depends
point.
what you want. It depends on
Yeah.
what you want to prove. And I just don't think that it would ever prove who is responsible for their deaths, if indeed
Uh,
they were killed in
yeah.
the tower.
I guess not. I mean, I suppose I suppose my argument for why it would be of benefit, and I can see it, I really can see it both sides. It's just that this is such a big question around the world that it would provide some evidence toward.
Oh, I'm not against it because I can see that
Mm,
there is some merit to it. All I'm saying is that it would not be it wouldn't prove Richard's guilt or innocence,
no, no,
because
it wouldn't.
even if it were proven that it were
Mm,
their remains, you would still have Ricardians saying that, oh right, well, we know that they were killed in the tower. We know they
yeah,
didn't survive, but therefore they could have survived into Henry VII's reign and he was
yeah,
responsible for this, which I have seen that argument made before.
yeah.
That's what I'm saying. It would not give you that evidence as to who was responsible for their
It,
deaths.
it absolutely
It
won't.
would prove
Oh,
it may prove if it is indeed their remains, but
mm.
it would not solve what this particular project is setting out to prove.
I agree. I mean, I think I, it would more or less restrict the culprits down to two or three candidates, I suppose. Basically, Richard Henry or maybe the Duke of Buckingham, because I think most people broadly accept that no one other than the king or someone so close to the king they may as well have been the king could possibly have authorized that, and it would have been accepted as an order.
Well, and would also have the application, it would have the motive, would have
Yeah,
the would have the access to the tower or to the princes without the compliance of one of those people.
exactly,
So,
exactly.
that's where I think that yes, you're right. It would narrow it down, but what it wouldn't do, it would not give you that. It would not give you that clear proof either way, I don't think.
I agree. I agree. Um, I suppose we should probably draw this to an end quite soon.
Yes.
These people have been
Well,
listening for
the thing
some time.
the final comment I would like to make, though,
Mm.
is that, for all that we've debated all of this, I would encourage people to read the book for themselves, because I
Yeah,
do
I
think
agree.
it is a very readable book. And if you're anything like me, you carried on reading it because it slightly annoyed you because of the conclusions that are being made, but
Mm.
that didn't stop it being a very readable thing. And
Very readable.
for anybody interested in the history of the period, I do think that it stimulated us debating it for an hour or so. So,
Mm.
I'm sure that it would stimulate a lot of other debate for other people. So I would recommend that people go and buy it. But what I would say is I would read it with a note of caution.
Very well said. I have nothing to add to that wisdom.
And that brings us to the end. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for making this such a stimulating debate, Gareth. And we will see you both. We will both see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you for listening to this Royal History Geeks one shot podcast episode. If you would like to check out the rest of our podcast series or episodes, go to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. And if you'd like to get involved with the debate, discussion, and dialogue online, then check out Royal History Geeks on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Discord.